day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webcast entitled From Garage to Global, Expanding the Right Way. Following the presentation, we will have a short question and answer session, barring the time. You can ask questions at any time during the presentation. Click the Ask a Question button and type in your questions in the open area and click Ask Question to submit. If you should need technical assistance, please type your inquiry into the tech support box on the left side of your screen and click the Send button. It is now my pleasure to turn the webcast over to your speaker, David Barry, Managing Editor, Dow Jones Conferences. David, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you, Dana, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone. On behalf of Dow Jones and our sponsor, Nair Co., I'd like to welcome you to what should be an informative discussion. Joining me today are four individuals with vast knowledge of what it takes for a startup to successfully expand abroad. Their views on the things to do and not to do will hopefully provide you with needed information as your company tackles new markets. First, giving us the entrepreneurial view is Evan Powell, CEO of Nexenta, which provides open-source enterprise-class storage software solutions and which has expanded throughout Asia and Europe. Prior to Nexenta, Evan was founding CEO and Vice President of Marketing and Business Development of Claris Systems. Could you say hi?
Hello, everybody. Look forward to chatting with you today.
Giving us an investor perspective is Jay co-founder and managing director of TransLink Capital, an early-stage venture firm focused on mobile, communications, and digital media that works to help its portfolio companies expand into Japan, China, and Korea. Jay is responsible for TransLink's investments in Carbonite, Enterprise DB, LiveScribe, and SoundHood, and supports the firm's portfolio companies with their customers and partners primarily in Korea. Prior to TransLink, Jay was head of Samsung Ventures America, Samsung's U.S. corporate venturing arm. I should also mention that Jay was good enough to step in for our originally scheduled venture investor, Tim Chang, who had another commitment come up. Jay, are you able to say hi?
Yes, I am. Hi, good morning, everyone.
Good. Providing us the legal perspective is Colin Chapman, a partner with Gunderson Detmer, who specializes in corporate partnering and alliances, technology protection, and licensing and commercialization of intellectual property and technology assets. He represents emerging growth companies both in the U.S. and abroad. Colin started out doing international law, helped set up the Tokyo office for another law firm, and has done work or established companies throughout Europe, South America, the Middle East, and most of Asia. Colin, could you say hi?
Good morning.
Finally, providing us a view on the important accounting and human resource issues is Sean Nair, co-founder and CEO of Nair Co., which services companies expanding abroad by providing an integrated solution for HR, finance, tax, and legal needs. Since founding the company in 1994, Sean has grown it into a global enterprise with offices in the UK, India, China, the US, Japan, and Singapore. Sean, would you please say hello?
Good morning or good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, depending on whether you're West Coast or East Coast.
The aim of this seminar is to give you insight into what you should be thinking about as your company begins expanding internationally. We are hoping to hit on some of the key issues, but we do encourage you to submit questions through the website, and if you're not on, I would also suggest you get on. We will try to get to as many of these as possible. $150 billion. That is roughly how much venture capitalists have pumped into U.S. startups over the past 5 years. But more than showing the confidence that investors have in the startups that have been created, it also illustrates that there's intense competition for business as well. Trying to survive by just going after business in the U.S. is probably not going to work for long. There's a growing need to expand internationally, whether it's China, India, Japan, or Europe. But to go into these countries, you must do the right things or it can delay or seriously hurt your chances of success. Let's start, if we can, with a basic question. When is the right time for companies to expand? Jay, your firm helps companies do just that. When does your firm feel comfortable working with a company to go overseas? What do you need to see, and what should they have in place? Jay?
Sure, David. I think that's actually a complex answer because I think it also depends on many factors. In particular, it depends ultimately, I think, primarily by where your customers are. So for many companies that are consumer-facing companies, we typically advise them to focus on building their business in their home turf. It's hard enough as it is to build a brand and build, the connection with the consumers. And so to try to do that and translate that overseas is extremely difficult. So some of our portfolio companies, where the end customer is actually in the consumer side of things, we encourage them to build their brand and presence in their local markets and become strong there, be able to generate good revenue before they even think about expanding overseas. On the other hand, if the company is providing technology and selling into other companies, and that could include component companies, telecom system companies, where in many cases some of the more aggressive early adopters of those new technology and some of the largest customers are actually overseas, in particular many of them in Asia, then these companies don't have a choice, but from day one they need to expand over there. So depending really on the sector and the products that they're building, we try to advise them to either wait, grow strong before going out, or venture them out, because really that's where their early customers are going to be.
And in terms of the how far along do they need to be in the product life cycle? They obviously need to have a product to do it, or is it in anticipation of launching a product, or?
So our firm, because we focus on connecting U.S. startup companies to customers and partners in Asia, particularly in Japan, Korea, and Greater China, from our experience, each of our partners have had backgrounds in running corporate venture arms for big Asian technology companies. We believe that the best time to go and visit the potential customers over there is really when you have something to show above and beyond just slideware. In many cases, just taking slides and sharing concepts and ideas, it actually doesn't create the right first impression. Many of the customers over there are fairly skeptical when they see the fancy PowerPoint slides and whatnot. They want to play around with either prototypes, demos, samples, actually see that the products can be built. And it doesn't have to be a full product, but it's something that can show a proof of concept. And so typically the time that we engage companies is after the companies have typically raised a seed round or a first round of financing and have gone through a year or two of development. And then we have something to actually get our arms around and make those introductions so that the potential customers and partners can actually see the companies can deliver.
Evan Powell of Nexenta, talk a few about your company, how it got ready to expand overseas, and what it did to make sure that it was doing it correctly.
Well, great. One of our largest customers is in Korea, and in our case, we sell software. We sell software that can be freely downloaded, and so customers try our product sort of every day all over the world. So from the first moment of having a product, we had leads sort of around the world. And for us, the decision-making process as to when to really address that demand came down to when did we have local partners that could actually do a good job managing those accounts, do a good job localizing our product if necessary, and so forth. So we made the decision very early, frankly, in Europe, probably 6 months into commercial rollout. We were getting first customers and, as I said, first partners in Europe. I would say in APAC, we waited probably another 6 months, but still you're talking after the first year of sales. And frankly, having just returned from the region, from Hong Kong, Japan, Taiwan, etc., now I wonder if we shouldn't have moved even quicker, because the demand there is just extraordinary, and the class of customers, at least that we're finding there, is really tremendous. Very knowledgeable, and in many cases very fast-moving customers.
So for us, it was. No, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Was there a reason that you did have the wait between Europe and Asia, and was there a reason why you felt more comfortable going to Europe first?
I think, frankly, some of it may just be the reflection of our initial team. So we did have both, European, and we actually have some development in Europe. So we did have European team members and so forth. So I think that's part of it. The other thing that we talk about when we're establishing, for example, a help desk overseas, is one reason to have help desks in, or a help desk in, let's say, APAC, Asia, it's 17 to 18 hours ahead. So while we think of Europe as being really really having a radically different time zone than the west coast of the United States, where we're headquartered, actually it's sort of nothing compared to it being, again, 17, 18 hours later, ahead in APAC. So I would say our sort of background made Europe more comfortable. That's one point. The second point is you just do have just the logistics being quite a bit different as well in APAC.
Okay. Colin Chapman of Gunderson Detmer, you've, as I mentioned, worked with a lot of companies around the world, and when is a company in your mind ready to tackle new markets, and what are the biggest things they need to think about before doing that?
Well, I think Jay's point at the beginning was that it's a complex question, and people go for many different reasons, and you could probably make some generalizations about different industries, but I essentially agreed with what he said. I think the one thing I would touch on is we've had quite a number of clients who have also gone over ahead of customers, ahead of having product, really for resource reasons, and that could be either labor resources or natural resources, such as the sun. And more recently, what we've seen is companies going in search of funding, and that's not necessarily venture institutional funding, it's government funding. Those have been more capital-intensive businesses where they're going to put a lot of jobs in a particular jurisdiction, and so there can be a lot of competition from different governments to get those facilities planted in their countries.
What advice would you have in terms of trying to understand what governments have to make it available? And that's something that a startup's not going to just know. Is that something where they need to go to a law firm to get some input, or who do they need to talk to understand what the options are and what might be available for them?
Well, I think some of the venture funds are positioned to do this now, and there are a few other organizations out there who have resources. It's not an easy thing to do, and I can't say that I've seen any systematic way that it's been accomplished. It's just we saw the same thing in this country in terms of different states competing for resources as well. So it generally comes out of really the management team and the board of the particular companies, that they have connections or can figure out a way or hear of an opportunity in a different country that aligns with their interests.
Down there, as I mentioned, your company works with companies that are expanding abroad, and what in your mind are the key issues in terms of whether a company is ready to take that leap or not, and what additional would you have to add to our other speakers?
There are a variety of reasons, in my experience, why companies go abroad. They may go abroad, as already stated, to get technology development done in a lower cost location. They may go abroad because they have customers in the U.S. who are multinationals whose foreign offices now need their product or service or composite offering. They may go abroad because they've already got a whole network of VARs selling for them, and this network now needs to be managed. Or they may be going abroad to test a new market for the first time. So there's a variety of reasons, why they go abroad. If you look today, though, at the areas that are most active, the BRIC countries, particularly, I would say, the BIC countries, Brazil, India, and China, are very active. We have a large number of clients and companies that we know that are wanting to set up operations in these countries. And unfortunately, although the markets are very active and there's good potential in these markets for many technology products, the costs of setting up in these countries and the employment and other exposures, particularly in Brazil, are very high. So essentially these are attractive markets, but companies do need very good local advice and support to be able to structure themselves properly and minimize their risks when they expand into these markets. On the other hand, if you look at the most popular, if you like, destinations that are historically been the case, obviously the UK has been one of the most favored for very, very obvious reasons. One of the common mistakes, or maybe they're taking a risk in the full knowledge of the risk, is when companies employ quote-unquote contractors, particularly in Europe. It's a cheap way to go, but it's a risky way to go because these contractors will usually fail the normal tests of self-employment, and they are deemed employees, and the risks come back to haunt the company if the contractor is not successful and is being terminated. Risks can also come in if, for example, contractors are generating sales and they are particularly successful, but the company now wants to insource that operation. There are European sales agency rules that effectively require the company to buy out the business that the contractor has generated in order to be able to internalize the support and internalize that activity. So the one caution I would say is, try not to use contractors in Europe. There are countries where contractors are fine, like Singapore and Hong Kong. But in Europe, it's a common mistake to go in there thinking this is the way I can put my toe in the water. It's actually a lot safer to employ them under short-term contracts with the terms of employment very clearly identified.
Yeah, I moved it on to the next slide because it seemed to be a good way to move into that. Maybe, Colin, I could come to you because I'm sure you get involved in these issues as well in terms of the correct way to set up operations abroad. What would you add additional to what Sean has said?
Well, I think if you've made the decision to go abroad and actually establish an entity, you want something that's similar to what you have in the United States, with limited liability, so that you can insulate the parent company from both tax and, as much as possible, employment issues. Those seem to be two of the three biggest risks that we see with overseas litigation, the third risk being related to corruption claims in the foreign country. So, if you're going to establish an entity, it's going to be perhaps the equivalent of a C corporation in the United States, and you're going to house your employees and your contractors from the particular jurisdiction in that entity. And then you're going to establish intercompany arrangements between the parent company and the subsidiary, and I think Sean will probably talk about that later. There's a lot of tax issues around that, and it's important to get good advice on that.
How long does it take for a company to do what you just laid out, Colin?
To get an entity set up, it really depends on the country. My experience is England has become much quicker. Parts of Asia can take quite a long time, several months.
I think the longest is, one of the longer ones among the more popular destinations is actually Brazil. A limitada in Brazil can take about 3 to 3.5 months to set up. Hong Kong and Singapore, like UK, are very fast. India used to take a while, but there are, literally yesterday, there were some proposals put out to actually set up companies electronically in India. Essentially they're moving from a paper-based system to an electronic-based system where companies can be set up literally within a couple of days. These are proposals at the moment. They haven't yet been implemented, but it's good that these proposals are on the table.
Jay, as I mentioned, you do work with your companies to get them to go abroad, whether specifically in Asia. What kind of advice, work do you give your companies in terms of trying to set up entities over there, and how much time do you usually expect it to take to get them settled over there?
Was that a question for me?
Yes, it was.
Yeah, sure. So again, it's one of those questions where it again depends on kind of which specific geography they're going after and which specific product, market, customer they're going after as well. Depending on the certain type of product, in particular in Asia, there's fairly well-established distributor networks, especially for component companies. So, for example, in Korea, if you're a component company building for consumer electronics or handsets and whatnot, typically the best course of action is to find a good distributor. Many of these distributors have previously worked for some of the customers out there, Samsung, LG, etc. They have great personal networks and are knowledgeable about the space. And so typically before you even set up your own entity and whatnot, we consider going after working with a distributor, making sure that there is in fact a real customer opportunity. And then if the business actually continues to grow, then they can make a consideration whether or not they want to establish a local entity or not. Similar cases in Japan, for example, where there is, I would say, probably a more frequent cases of setting up, excuse me, local ventures, and in many cases also joint ventures out there to do business. But again, I think what we advise typically to the company is before you go ahead and set up entities, which obviously cost money and effort as well as take time, we want to make sure that there's validation on the customer opportunity before we go out there. And so typically the first few months of the interaction is really to guide them through the customer, find them the right distribution channel and partner there, and then make an assessment of whether or not the opportunity is large enough to consider setting up a local entity.
And what in your mind is large enough, or what's enough to do it? Is it just a contract with one major company, or is it a series of contracts, or what works for you?
Yeah, David, I have to apologize. I'm giving you kind of dual answers all the time, but again, it really depends.
Yeah.
Because in certain cases, let's say it's an equipment vendor for semiconductor manufacturing. Well, then, for example, a Samsung could be, their largest customer by far and generate more than half of their entire revenue. Then in that case, it makes sense to consider setting up a local entity, not only for a sales effort, but also to make sure that you're following up on the customer requests, making sure that there's no technical glitches, making sure that the customers feel comfortable that you're delivering on what you're telling them you'll deliver. And then in other cases, it may not make sense to have a local entity because your distribution partner actually is managing that quite well. So again, I don't think there's a set number that makes sense in terms of revenue. I think probably what's more important is kind of the importance and the weight of that particular customer in that market is also a driving factor of whether or not you want to be somebody close there. But even then, whether or not you set up a local entity is something that has to be thought through very carefully before making that commitment.
That's good. We had a question from the audience I think would be good. Sean or Colin, maybe you could tackle this. How do you hire a short-term employee in a country where you do not have an entity? Even if a foreign entity can hire an individual, what do you do to provide benefits?
Shall I take that one, or do you want to do it, Colin?
No, go ahead. I'll chip in.
Okay. If it's just a single contractor, according to this question, it's a contractor in Switzerland. The answer is it depends on the country. In the case of Switzerland, there is a way to actually hire the person as a short-term employee, but register the person himself for taxes, and therefore what you would do is you would not have to set up anything. You would register that person himself for taxes. You would pay him the gross amount, and then tell him how much of that he needs to pay over in taxes. And you would need to set up a system with him to enable him to demonstrate to you that he has actually paid over that amount, so that you can be sure that you're not going to have a comeback from the tax authorities at some future point because he hasn't done what he told you he has done. That is actually an easy way to have a short-term employee in Switzerland, if it's just one. And if the employee is not a quote-unquote senior-level person. So, in other words, so long as you don't call him VP or director.
Alan, did you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. One of the other things you have to think about is, and we get the tax folks involved in this, is whether you're going to create some sort of permanent establishment and create a broader tax issue because you then got to report in that country. You sort of have to balance that against, we work with a lot of very young companies that are really resource constrained and frankly don't have the time to do a lot of things. So, and are in a position, or have decided they're in a position to take a little bit more risk. And so in some of those cases, if we can't get an entity established and we can't find a partner, as Jay suggested, we may just actually interpose a subsidiary here in the United States that we can get established quickly and lowly capitalize and employ the person through that entity.
Correct.
It's not an ideal structure, but I'd view it as a patch, a short-term patch.
Okay. Well, let's talk about another key issue, which is communication, and obviously setting up an operation abroad, trying to keep employees in the U.S. informed of what's going on, and also make sure that the networking is getting done and the work with the companies abroad is getting done. So, Evan, be good to bring you in. Accent, as I mentioned, has made a lot of has set up a lot of operations around the world. What can you tell the audience about how you guys have attempted or attempting to handle communication and keep everybody on the same page?
Sure. Well, I think it's a critical question. So as a fast-growing startup, I believe that our culture, our sort of shared norms of behavior, is critical for us to get right. And it's pretty difficult when we have about a third of our employees, in fact, were contractors, as they once were, in Russia, in fact. And many of us here, including myself, don't speak Russian. So what do we do to sort of form that shared sense of identity, which I at least believe to be absolutely critical to moving quickly and to building the right kind of company? So in our case, we do things, we're probably a little more programmatic or dogmatic about things like having everybody sign what we call our customer pledge. So for us, customer service is very important. So I have everybody sign a pledge, and it's translated into Russian as well when they come on board as an employee, so they're very clear on what we expect of them in terms of being customer focused. Similarly, when I have an all-company meeting, I always have 2 all-company meetings, and I conduct one entirely in Russian and in the appropriate time zone. So obviously there's a translation involved there in my case. And then, you ask on these slides, how often should you go overseas? I think the answer is very often. Even if you have, as we do in our case, trusted, if you will, lieutenants and a team that's well aligned, I still think it's important to be there and to form those high bandwidth relationships with people there and to get to know them. And so I try to have all company meetings from Russia or from, we actually also from Texas, which we often joke is another one of our foreign locations. So, as the case may be, I think our job in part, and my executive team's job in part, is to, plant the flag and to make sure everybody knows that the folks right around the world are all part of the same team. So those are a couple quick thoughts I had, David.
Yeah, no, it's good.
There is one issue, Dave, that's also important for companies to worry about, and I'm concerned that I don't see any companies at the moment worrying about it at all, at least the ones I've spoken to recently. That's arising from the beefing up of the data protection rules in Europe. The UK now has a £500,000 penalty for serious breaches of the data privacy rules. Essentially, the U.S. companies, at the moment that I've spoken to, don't seem to have any internal procedures that govern the communications between the U.S. Head office and the regional offices in Europe. So, for example, you can't stop an email from a U.S. person to John Smith in Europe about his mental illness going by mistake to Jack Smith. But if you don't have internal procedures that are clearly laid out and communicated to all your employees, U.S. and European, that attempt to prevent a mistake like that from happening, then when a mistake like that happens, you are much more exposed than if you didn't have procedures of that type. So a lot of the time, U.S. companies are aware of data privacy, but they're not aware of the impact those regulations have on how they have to conduct their internal communications between the U.S. offices and the European offices. And that lack of appreciation of the rules and the risks they're running does worry me.
That's good, Sean. I'm glad you brought that up because we're talking probably more on the slide about external, but internal is equally important.
Yeah.
Jay, what thoughts do you have, or what do you suggest to your companies in terms of trying to keep communication going well between the offices here and abroad, and both, I guess, from an external and an internal basis?
Right. So, Evan's already mentioned this point, and I can't emphasize this any stronger, but really, a lot of companies try to manage their overseas offices driven primarily by efficiency, and in many cases that efficiency leads to more email communication, more phone conferences and whatnot, but really there's really no substitute for actually going out there and meeting people and checking out the body language. And plus, it gives them an opportunity to get them in front of customers, hear directly from the customers without any sort of filtering in terms of what their concerns are, what their satisfaction level is. And, the mistake that I see happening in certain companies, and this is a hard problem because once a company grows to a point where they're established with multiple locations all over the world, it becomes very difficult. But I've seen personally some of the, I would say, the more experienced CEOs out there actually have a regularly scheduled rotation of visiting their local offices out there, and they obviously coincide that with customer visits. And so, it's basically getting two birds with one stone, where you get a chance to hear direct feedback from the customers, as well as get a chance to hear some of the concerns and issues from your employees overseas as well. So that's the one key discipline, I think, is to get out there and meet the people rather than, the efficient email track or the phone conversations where you really don't know what the other side is saying or seeing. You don't know what the body language is, and it's just far less effective.
Is that a conversation you have with your entrepreneurs early on when you say, we have this opportunity to expand to Korea, we think it's a good one, but you also need to be aware that you're going to be needing to go there once every 4 weeks, 6 weeks, pick a number sort of thing?
Right. So Dave, we actually have that as part of our investment process. So before TransLink makes any investment in any company, our rule of thumb is that we actually work with the startup companies here in the U.S. and make sure that there is real opportunities over there in Asia. And in most cases, we will hop on a plane with the CEO or the entrepreneur, take them out to visit the customers and partners, kind of on a roadshow. And because of that process, we get to see whether or not the entrepreneur or CEO that we'll be working with has the right the right skill set and attitude, frankly, to be able to be successful in conducting business over there. And so through that process, we get a sense of whether or not, the entrepreneur is really just getting dragged out there, they're not really engaged, and, they can't wait to get back on the flight home, versus whether or not they really are engaged with the customers as well as potential distribution partners and potential employees there. And so it becomes a very quick process where we get to know each other well, and it's very obvious whether or not that CEO entrepreneur is going to continue to do business in those markets the right way. So in many cases, actually in most cases, we don't even have to have that conversation. with our CEOs or entrepreneurs because we are already well confident that they have the right skill set and attitude to do that.
Interesting. Colin, do you have anything to add to this conversation?
Yeah, I suppose to Sean's point, he's absolutely right about that Europe has, in the last few years, treated privacy a lot more rigorously than folks in the U.S. have. But it's changing here, and we have found that it's not been, most U.S. companies that we're involved with already have protocols in place to address this. And when you put an operation in the ground in Europe, you then become subject to all of those regulations, whereas companies before they've got an operation there can take advantage of what's called the safe harbor in terms of their privacy management policies. So it's something to be aware of, but it's not. It's very manageable.
Okay. Well, let's move into obviously a key part. We hit on this a little bit earlier, which is the accounting issues, tax issues, and the like. And Sean, why don't you take us through these next couple of slides and perhaps give folks an overview of some of the things they need to be thinking about as they move into the other countries in this area.
Sure. I'll do this fairly quickly. Basically, the first thing is the first point there is probably pretty obvious, but it's surprising how often one comes across companies where the CFO actually has not been told by his local country service provider as to what all his filings are and what all the deadlines are for the filings. It sounds kind of obvious that you would have that information at your fingertips and that you would actually have a filing calendar for all of your foreign entities in all the countries where you are. But it's often the case that is not so. You ask the CFO, do you know what all your filings are? And he says, well, I'm relying on my local service provider to do it. So you say, how do you know that the local service provider is actually delivering on all of the filings? Because some of the filings may be accounts filings, some may be tax filings, some may be corporate governance-related filings. And if there are different people dealing with these things, then how do you actually know? So it's very important, in my view, to actually prepare a filing calendar that lists by country that you're in all of your filings in descending order of priority, from the most important ones, which attract the highest penalties, to the minor ones that you still need to do, even if no penalty, to ensure your foreign entities in good standing. I've given an example of what I mean in a very generic kind of way in the next slide, on which I'm not going to dwell too long, but that slide gives you an example of what I'm talking about. You then obviously need to run payroll and maintain your management accounts, and these management accounts have to be done to U.S. GAAP to enable you to do your month-end consolidations and prepare your board reporting package. Equally, at the end of the year, you have to produce local GAAP accounts to file with the Chambers of Commerce or Companies House or equivalent. You have to prepare corporate tax filings, payroll filings, and if you're a public company and you've got ESPP offered out to your international employees, which, by the way, is an expensive thing to do, you've got ESPP-related filings. So essentially, the main point here is that I think you need to know what all your filings are. You need to be actively be managing the service provider if you've outsourced it, or managing your internal regional controllers if your operations are large enough to merit insourcing it. You shouldn't actually just be relying on them. They should be being actively managed, because many, many times there are mistakes made, filing deadlines missed, etc., which is not very good if you're trying to sell your company at some point down the line. Moving 2 slides down, I wanted also to touch on a slightly different point. The first one is multi-country accounting. In the current economic environment, particularly in regions like the EU, the tax authorities are talking much more closely to each other. And essentially, it's very important to ensure that your accounts for your different entities are kept in a very consistent manner, and if you're a public company, that they're kept in conformity with the new SSAE 16 regulations that are replacing SAS 70. The only way you can do this is by centralizing your accounting and essentially applying SAS 70 compliant procedures, so that when the audit is done, or rather I should say SAS 70 examination is done, you're found to be in compliance. Another area where people need advice and support is when U.S.-based personnel become directors of foreign entities. So often the CEOs, CFOs, CTOs of the clients become directors of subsidiaries in foreign countries, and they often don't know the risks, the personal risks they're taking when they agree to become these directors and take these positions. Some of these risks can be covered by insurance, but there are certain risks that can't. For example, let's take a country like UK, which is fairly benign. If you have an operation that has at least 20 or more people, you need a written health and safety policy. If you don't have such a policy and you have an event that results in an injury or death, the directors of the UK company can be prosecuted under corporate manslaughter charges. It's a criminal prosecution, and essentially a strong defense would be if you could show evidence that you have established a procedure on health and safety policy in the UK organization, that you've fully communicated it to the employees, and where if it's convoluted enough, that you've actually given them an opportunity to be trained on it, on the do's and don'ts. That's one area where people here, blithely agree to be directors of Australian companies, UK companies, Singapore companies, but they don't fully appreciate the personal risks they're taking when they agree to do that. There are also certain countries where, for example, one has to be very careful about getting the right D&O coverage. For example, in France, if you're a director of a French company, the coverage is only valid under French regulations if the underwriter is also based in France. So if you go to your U.S. Agent who's providing you with D&O cover here and just ask him to extend the cover to France, he'll probably do it. And you probably won't know anything is amiss until and unless you have a need to make a claim, at which point there will be an issue if the underwriting for that particular part of the policy was not done in France. I'd also mentioned earlier about BRIC countries, and really in the context of corruption. These countries have got, on a corruption scale, come lower down the scale than the U.S. does. There is an institute in Berlin that publishes a corruption index. The U.S. is around about 23, 24. Brazil, India, and China are very close at about around about 38, 39. And Russia is pretty much at the bottom in terms of being extremely corrupt. The UK has a Bribery Act. The US, of course, has the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. These regulations apply if you have an entity in either of these countries. So if you have a UK subsidiary, the UK Bribery Act applies to all of your operations worldwide, just as FCPA does. And in certain instances, the UK Bribery Act is actually more stringent than FCPA. So again, you need to have blowing the whistle procedures to be able to show that if a corrupt act has occurred somewhere, that there is a mechanism within the company for flagging it up to the highest level, that people don't get victimized for flagging it up, and that the company's management is showing a commitment to dealing with it. These are just a few touch points on the slide. I could spend ages on it, and I'm not going to bore you with it. But if there are any questions on that, we'll be happy to take it afterwards.
Okay, very good, Sean. And Jay, it'd be good just to get your perspective as, again, an investor who's got companies that go overseas. What are the maybe some of the things that you tell them to be particularly concerned about when it comes to accounting or board issues or that sort of thing? Anything that really sticks out, or that you try and make sure it doesn't cause trouble?
Well, so this has actually been quite educational for me, and it's one of those things that, I don't think any typical venture capitalist would know the right details, and it would actually be more dangerous for us to be advising our companies about that. All I can say is the best advice we could give them is probably to find the right professionals that can provide the most accurate information for that kind of support. It's one of those issues that, frankly, I think many firms, both in the boardroom, whether you're an investor or senior management, in many cases do not take as seriously as they should. And it's one of those issues where you get that email or that call and that, oh no moment before you realize that we were not prepared properly to deal with these issues. So it's something that I guess going forward we will be looking into more aggressively, but quite frankly, in terms of specifics, it's something that we would strongly advise our companies to seek the right professional help, both on the legal side and the accounting side, to be able to handle it. What we would expect, quite frankly, and I believe most investors would, is that the management team has had enough experience with these issues and are already working with the right professional firms to support them.
Okay. Well, let's maybe hit on a few of the few things that maybe we haven't talked about, things that are perhaps overlooked or people don't think about until it's too late. Obviously, some of the things that Sean just brought up fit very much into that category, but Colin Chapman, it'd be good to get your thoughts on the legal side. What are maybe a couple of things that we haven't talked about that companies need to think about or really need to consider as they're expanding abroad?
Yeah. Well, I think what Sean just discussed a little earlier was just spot on. Those are all key issues, and they come up in virtually every discussion, and particularly on the FCPA piece, because the U.S. government, not just the English government, the U.S. government has become very aggressive in terms of asserting these claims, and they will settle them. So we're not seeing a lot of people go to jail for them, but there is criminal liability, and you should be aware of that. But the amount of money that's being asked and being settled for is significant, and it can have a really damaging impact. It's enough so that it could have a significant impact on the operations of the company. It's also quite difficult to get reasonable coverage for that, insurance coverage for that. So the advice that we've given our people, and it sounds somewhat trite, but you really have to focus on who you're hiring and have them understand what the implications are for the company if they engage in these practices. And around the world there are very different customs and practices, and so not everyone is familiar with sort of the Western European model, but the consequences can be significant. I think, most other areas, we've touched on most other areas at some level, but I think the one I would probably look at also is, and people may be familiar with this already, but when you export technology out of the United States, oftentimes it requires a license, or you have to go through an approval process to confirm that no license is required. And so I would put that on your checklist of items, and this includes not just technology, but it can include data as well. And I would put that on your list of items to vet ahead of time. Oftentimes, for many technologies, this is not a difficult issue to address. For some, it may be, and it may regulate the countries that you can actually set up operations in or move technology towards. We talked about privacy, IP protection. I mean, it sounds fairly obvious, I suppose. It's really a function of the business and where what kind of technology you're going to put in a foreign country, and the types of legal protections, and not just the infrastructure, but the availability of real remedies. In many places, they're just not available, even though the laws are there, and so you have to make pragmatic decisions about what you're going to do.
Good. Evan, did you have anything to add in terms of things that you've learned from your own experiences, things that we haven't hit on or that really companies should give more thought to as they're thinking about expanding abroad?
So I think I would second what Jay said, which is, you've got to find the right expert assistance, and to that point, you have to have the right, I think, mindset, understanding that the mindsets overseas are very different, and it's not, obviously there are massive cultural differences across the globe. So something that you take for granted, it's just a normal thing, that's your blind spot, right? If you take it for granted that everyone behaves in this way, that's exactly where you may be caught out, which the point is, again, it's all the more important to have the right expert advice as you expand globally so that you do have the support and that you are actually following local regulations correctly and so forth. So I would just second that point. Frankly, as an entrepreneur, we're busy doing all sorts of things, right, that we think add value to the company, but I think it's an important point to not be blinded by the risks you're taking as you grow, and you're never going to be as expert as, for example, some of the guys on the call here today. So certainly in my case, we really rely on experts, and I would just second that point.
Very good, Evan. All right, so we're down to the point now where we'll hit on some of the questions that have come in. I've seen a couple people questions about presentations, and we'll work with our vendor to get those out to you. We're happy to send those out. A couple of questions that came in. I think, Sean, is probably up your alley, but if somebody else has a thought, any advice on transfer pricing studies for tax purposes, average cost, when to document or prepare such a study?
Depends very much on the transfer pricing study. There are basically 3 different types of, or maybe 4 different types of transfer pricing agreements. You have the standard cost plus, you have the commissionaire, which is a variant on the cost plus, where you treat the foreign subsidiary as a sales agent and you pay them a commission on sales they generate. You can have a stripped, in UK at least, because I'm British, we call strip buy sell, which is where the local subsidiary acts as effectively as a collection agent and contracting agent for its parent, and then you have the true buy sell. There are 2 elements. You have to prepare the transfer pricing agreement, and when preparing the transfer pricing agreement, often one of the pitfalls that happens is that these agreements are prepared by the corporate tax departments of the professional services firm that you use. But nobody in the VAT department, the VAT department, often looks at these agreements. And often when the companies have a VAT audit in the local country, the VAT inspectors ask for this agreement very early on in an investigation because they're looking for wording that allows the local subsidiaries to charge VAT because they want to try and slap VAT if they can on intercompany invoices. So when you're drafting these transfer pricing agreements, it's important that you have them reviewed from a VAT perspective as well as a tax perspective. Once you've got the agreement in place, the other important thing you should do is to benchmark the transfer price or the cost plus percentage. The regularity with which you recalibrate this varies with country. So, for example, in India, because of the stringency of the regulations there and the amount of companies getting attacked and being with large cost plus percentages, for example, being demanded for R&D type operations, I would recommend that the cost plus percentage is benchmarked every year. In other jurisdictions, once every 5 to 6 years, and probably that'll be the lifetime of a company of the type that's venture-backed because it'll probably be sold by then. So you do it once and you hope you're sold before you have to do it again, in all probability, would be fine in locations like Singapore, Hong Kong, Japan. In Europe, especially if you have subsidiaries in multiple European countries, because the tax authorities there are increasingly talking to each other, particularly between France, Germany, and within the Benelux countries and between Netherlands and Germany, we have noticed. It's important that when you benchmark your transfer price or your cost plus percentage, that you do a benchmark across all of these countries and you correlate them, so that if you're asked a question in an investigation as to why you have one transfer price in country A and another one in country B, you can throw the transfer pricing report at them as justification. So I think, we're in a strange position where we have a worldwide recession we're all coming out of. Companies are going abroad earlier than they would normally in their lives. They're all struggling to sell. Cost is very important. And yet you have the government short of cash and the tax authorities leaning on all these companies a lot harder than they did 5 years ago when the world was booming. So you have like an irresistible force meeting an immovable object. And most companies need to somehow manage to navigate so that they don't end up in the Big Bang.
Very good. We had another question. Colin, maybe you can take this one. The company's looking to add a contractor in Brazil, but I guess the general question is, what are the risks of having a contractor rather than an employee?
Well, I think the point that Sean made earlier, it's actually the same issue that you can have in this country as well. It's depending on how much that individual or that entity is working for your company, they may be reclassified as an employee. But that analysis isn't all that different from here, and sometimes people take that risk. I think the advantages of using a contractor can be you can hedge your risk in terms of your tax exposure in the other country, and even though in some cases if you're using them for as a sales agent, you may have some potential exposure if you terminate them. It tends to still be a lot easier to manage them than it is employees.
I just have a little footnote there, because this question actually, funnily enough, came up just last week with a company. It's actually illegal to have engage a person in their personal capacity as a contractor in Brazil. In Brazil, they don't have the concept of a rep office. A branch requires presidential approval, so it's not something you're going to go for. The only way you can set up in Brazil is a limitada, and a limitada costs a fortune to set up and a fortune to manage. So how do you manage if you want to just engage one person in Brazil? There is risk, but the least risky way is to get that person to set up their own personal limitada, and then contract with that limitada. There is still risk, because there is a risk that the authorities could look through that and deem that you are operating illegally in Brazil. And the risk then is that they could go to your customers in Brazil and, having levied a penalty on you, require them to divert the payments to the tax authorities. But it's not a huge risk for one person. It's probably realistically, you're kind of in business, so you're balancing cost and risk all the time. It may be an acceptable balance. But I think hiring the contractor as an individual is risky in Brazil. Get him to set up his own limitada.
Right. We're almost out of time here. I don't know, just a quick answer on this one. When does foreign income become taxable in the U.S.? Is that a quick answer, Sean?
I'm not an expert on this, but there is a U.S. process called check the box. When you check the box, and it's something that you would normally do when you first set up the subsidiary before it actually acquires value. I believe when you check the box, the foreign subsidiary is treated as a branch for U.S. tax purposes, so that the income flows through and gets taxed here, but you get a tax credit not under the U.S. local country double tax treaty rules, but under the U.S. check the box rules. You get a tax credit for what you paid in corporate taxes abroad. That way your foreign income, that is one way in which foreign income can become taxable in the U.S. That may be an advantage, that may be a disadvantage. But one advantage of checking the box is that you don't have to worry about PE risks in the U.S. In other words, the IRS saying that because you, the directors of the foreign company, are here in the U.S., the foreign company is managed in the U.S., therefore the foreign company has a taxable presence in the U.S., and therefore owes taxes to the IRS. That's one way of of basically negating that risk is by checking the box.
Yeah, this is Colin. I would. This is one where I'd go right to your tax advisors because the regulations are currently being written on this, and it's a complicated question.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Well, with that, we're going to have to leave it. I want to thank all of the people for all of you for listening in and your questions, and I want to thank our panelists, Evan Powell of Nextana, Jay of Translate Capital, Colin Chapman of Gunderson Detmer, and Sean Nair of Nair Co. And also thank Nair Co. for their sponsorship again. And with that, I will turn it back to Dana.
Thank you for joining. You may now disconnect.